Good afternoon. Do you have a moment to talk about how you can find true fulfillment and strength, perhaps from a powerful, life-changing figure? Hold on. You misunderstand. I was talking about the God of War.
Damn, thought I had that one. So last month, Sony ported another game from the PlayStation library onto Steam. They brought God of War 2018 to PC in early 2022, and now they're following suit with the sequel. I did play through the last game and found it pretty enjoyable. I even returned to it a few times, but I never could get myself to pull the trigger on the PC version. Later in 2022, Sony released God of War Ragnarok. I played through this one and enjoyed it as well, but I didn't enjoy it quite as much as the first one. While it had some pretty cool ideas and mechanics, there were a lot of things that kind of brought down the experience for me. And yet, I bought the PC version on day one. So what changed? At the end of 2023, Sony released a piece of free DLC titled Valhalla. And this DLC really captured my interest more than either of these two reboot games ever did. One of the strongest elements of these two games is their combat, which fully takes center stage in Valhalla, making it an easy purchasing decision for me. So in honor of this PC re-release, I'm putting out this video specifically about Valhalla because I really just wanted to talk about something that I genuinely like a lot. This DLC was a little hard to figure out when it was first announced. I think specifically the most confusing thing about it was the price point, $0. I mean, these days we're used to being nickel and dimed for everything under the sun with some games. Surely this thing couldn't have been anything too substantial if it was being given free of charge. But lo and behold, the DLC came out in December, and not only was it a decent quantity of content, but it was actually pretty damn good. Taken in isolation, without Ragnarok being attached to it, I would consider Valhalla to be one of my favorite games ever. I actually kinda wish there was a way to buy Valhalla separately from Ragnarok, as I really don't have any interest in revisiting the campaign of that game, and if I suddenly did get the urge, I could just boot it up on the PS5 again. With all that said, I will be spoiling some plot and mechanic elements of Valhalla in this video, so dip out now if you want to go in blind. So Valhalla sees Kratos traveling to, Valhalla at the instruction of a mysterious letter. After a bit of a false start and some character interaction with the Valkyries, we come to find that Valhalla is basically a roguelite dungeon. Sony have remixed the various realms from the main game into combat arenas and sanctuaries that are visited somewhat randomly with a loose structure to the overall progression. One thing that makes it hard for me to revisit games like God of War 2018 or Ragnarok is the pacing. Frequent cutscene interruptions and entire sections of the game that feel a little slower and/or deviate from what makes me like the game can be forgiven on a first playthrough, but on subsequent playthroughs I really struggle to push past them. Valhalla's pacing is amazing in comparison. I like to smack, stab, and slice monsters in these games, and now I can do just that at a really nice pace. You enter an arena, face some enemies, maybe do the same thing again in a second room, and then you get a little breather, usually with a bit of dialogue between Kratos and whoever's on his hip, then you're right back into the action. And you don't even have to wait for them to finish chatting. If you're itching to jump back in, they'll bookmark the conversation for later.
This conversation will have to wait. Time to push along. Understood.
And Sony really could have just settled for some new in-game dialogue between 2 or 3 characters and let the rest be completely game-driven, sticking with the pre-established mechanics and elements. But beyond what we've seen already, Valhalla introduces some stuff that hasn't been seen from the franchise for more than a decade. Since Valhalla apparently pulls things from the mind of its challenger, we get to see new zones and enemies pulled from Kratos' old life in Greece. And more than that, we get a whole story arc with Kratos having to reconcile his present and future with his troubling past. There's a new character introduced, we get to see Kratos really reflecting on his actions from his old life, and everything just feels very focused on the central conflict that he faces. It's a smaller story, there's no world-ending conflict, but for me it just felt much easier to get invested in Kratos' journey through Valhalla. I'm not saying the dialogue is mind-blowing or anything, but it's pretty dang good, and for the most part I enjoy getting to hear these characters talk to each other. But perhaps the coolest thing that was reintroduced in this DLC was the Blade of Olympus. Sony smartly brought out this new rage mode pretty early into the campaign. As someone who played God of War 2 and 3 back in the day, I remember loving the Blade of Olympus and the harsh red color palette associated with it. It was just so bold and saturated, I loved it. And seeing that return in this DLC put a little twinkle in my gamer eye. And it's made even better by the fact that it actually ties in with the narrative and themes of this DLC. Kratos is being forced to wrestle with his past, and this weapon is a big part of that past, similar to the Blades of Chaos. So they brought this weapon back, color palette and all, and it's still a blast to use. The moveset isn't quite as diverse as the Leviathan Axe or the Blades of Chaos, but it's just a rage mode at the end of the day. Its use is a little different from the standard rage mode because this one doesn't restore health in any way, which is fair because if it did I would literally never use any other rage mode ever. So with the standard rage mode, I would kind of use it as a saving throw. Whenever I was really close to death, it would allow me to get in some good damage while also giving myself a bit of a health buffer. This new rage art I tend to use more as a brute force tactic against enemies that seem like they're gonna give me some trouble, which kind of shifts the rage mechanic from a defensive one to an offensive one, and I found this to be quite satisfying. It's more proactive versus reactive. There is quite a bit of reacting in this DLC though, particularly in the Greek portion. They did bring back the mechanic involving the use of a specific weapon or element to make an enemy vulnerable to general damage, and I don't quite remember how often this cropped up in Ragnarok, but it felt a little more common in Valhalla. But then when you get to the Greek portion, they also introduce something that I'm going to call rage draining. A lot of Greek enemies will have a particular move that, if successful, will create a tether between them and you and will eventually drain your rage meter. This incorporates that same mechanic of using a particular element to sever the link before you can then deal normal damage to them again. All of the fights in Greece also involve a time element. This timer will drop to 0 after a few minutes, and once it does, all the enemies will become a little tougher to take down. And while I can appreciate what they were going for with this mechanic, I don't know if I love it. It tends to make things feel a little hectic and stressful, especially with Helios smugly egging you on the whole time.
Incoming left side!
I also don't hate it, and for some people this added tension may even be a bonus. Overall, I still have a really good time going through the Greek zone. Beyond that, the combat in Valhalla is about what you come to expect from the 2018 game and Ragnarok. You do get a downgrade at the beginning of the DLC, but you still maintain a pretty good chunk of your arsenal. I think almost all of the upgrades pertaining to the weapon movesets are maintained, with just a few moves being removed to be given back as rewards in each run through Valhalla. As I mentioned before, this DLC is a roguelike, or I guess more accurately a rogue-lite. Most combat encounters in Valhalla will net you some kind of reward that persists only for that particular run. Maybe a stat increase, or a new runic attack, or some kind of perk. And they're presented in many forms. Sometimes it'll be a chest that'll give you a choice between a couple of things, sometimes it'll be a choice between multiple chests, or maybe you'll be given a choice of doors to go through that will give you one type of reward or another. Sony came up with a list of symbols to help determine at a glance what sort of reward is contained in a chest or behind a door, but I found it took me quite a while to recognize some of these symbols at a glance, and really I'm still not at a point where I can recognize all of them right away. I think they probably could have gone with some more intuitive symbols for these chests and doors. One other small gripe I have is with perks in particular. There are definitely some very cool and useful ones, but there are also some that are very wordy and specific, and I find myself having to read them and reread them a few times before I really soak in what it is that they do. And then I usually end up picking the other option because these wordy perks tend to not seem all that useful to me. That said, one thing I do appreciate about the reward system in Valhalla is how it seems to favor synergy. You're told at the beginning that when choosing between two rewards, your choice will affect future rewards that the game presents you with. The most obvious component of this is picking, say, a runic attack for the Blades of Chaos, which will then lead to you getting more reward options for the Blades of Chaos as opposed to the Leviathan Axe or the Draupnir Spear. But it also seemed to me that when I would pick a perk, I would then shortly thereafter be presented with another perk that synergized really well with the one that I just got. Maybe it's just a coincidence and maybe I just imagined it, but I noticed a few different instances where it seemed like the game was trying to match up perks in this way. So if it was intentional, that's pretty sick. I do kind of wish that any given run in Valhalla lasted a bit longer, or at least had the option to, specifically after you finish the campaign portion. Like I said, the pacing during that part is pretty great, but I wouldn't mind going a bit longer on subsequent runs. So additionally, there are also more permanent upgrades that can be purchased at the stones in the starting area. There's also a station where you can change the appearance of your weapons and outfits, and once you clear the campaign of the DLC, you can even change Kratos' appearance, which was a nice touch. They even let you carry this over into the main campaign in New Game Plus, along with the Blade of Olympus Rage mode. But I suppose since I picked this thing up on PC, I should talk about some of the technical stuff. There's been a lot of talk online about the requirement of a PlayStation account login and requiring an internet connection to play the game. I did do some brief testing by completely disconnecting my computer from the internet. I played for about 30 minutes while offline, and I didn't run into any issues. Longer sessions may eventually run into some kind of problem, but frankly, I'm too lazy to test for that. It does seem that a PlayStation account is required, which is particularly annoying in certain countries where you just can't get one. Beyond that, I generally had little issue with this game. Playing in ultra-wide was no issue, most of the graphical settings were pretty intuitive, and the game played smooth as butter. Now, I do have an above average setup for my PC, so I can't speak for what the typical experience might be, but there are some games that can still look and feel janky even on this rig. There are a few sticking points, like mandatory TAA or some form of upscaling. An issue I did run into was this message telling me my system was out of memory. My game ended up crashing twice, which is annoying because that sent me all the way outside of Valhalla. I'm still not sure exactly what was going on, but I updated my graphics drivers and that seems to have sorted it out. But otherwise, it was a pretty painless experience, aside from the 180 plus gigabytes this thing takes up. That did hurt my SSD a bit. I had hoped this would be a touch cheaper, especially since I kinda just wanted to get Valhalla on its own, but it is what it is. I can now play this game in ultra-wide and not have to pull it up on the PlayStation. The more I can keep all my games in one place, the better. Would I recommend Ragnarok on PC to anyone else? It's kinda hard to. I'm not head over heels for the main campaign, so even if you haven't played it before, I don't know if I would wholeheartedly recommend it, even though it has some great moments. And I would also be hard-pressed to recommend you spend $60 and almost 200 gigs of hard drive space to play a DLC that was initially free, assuming you owned the main game already. And then there's all the weirdness with the PlayStation account situation. I guess I really can't give you a recommendation. The only thing I can tell you for sure is that Valhalla kicks ass. And as usual, it's time for me to prostrate myself and humbly point you in the direction of my Patreon. You can support me financially for $1 or $2, and you can also get some bonus content over there. I'm even cooking up some new ideas for Patreon content at the moment, so give it a look. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.